right, so I'm going to share screen and we're going to go a bit backwards and forwards because I said to Mike in asking him questions, Mike's been a big influence in my ABCD work for many, many years. And there's some of his tools and things that he's taught me over the years that I've extended into other practices as well. So we'll be showing you a bit of both. So
That'd be great.
Yeah, I'll share this screen. But firstly, Mike, I'd like you to introduce yourself, please.
I live in Denver, Colorado, in the United States, and I'm 73 years old. So I'm one thing I'm learning how to be old, and I've been married 30 years, and I have a daughter, Annie, who lives in an intentional community right in the middle of the virus area in near New York City. And she's a person with disabilities and a wonderful community. And I've been involved in ABCD since 1992, since since the Green Book and started. And I am really happy to be with Dee, and all the more it makes me happy to be with Mike Mather, who's a dear friend, and with David Portillo, who's a dear friend, and with all of you. And it makes me just recognize that in a way, we're talking about we will survive through friendship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded that there's nothing more important.
Thanks, Mike. And Mr. Mather, would you just introduce yourself briefly?
My name's Mike Mather. I'm in Indianapolis, Indiana, in the United States. And I live and work in a low-income community here in Indianapolis, where I've been for the past 17 years. I'm a pastor in a church.
You're importantly moving to Colorado.
I am moving to Colorado.
Thanks, Mike. So just to start with this concept of discovering care, and I remember, I think the first workshop that you and I did together in Australia, Mike, I think it was 2003, something like that. And this was just changed my world, this idea of this discovering care. And I can remember, and I still repeat the line often to people about, when we discover what people care about enough to act on, we mobilize communities. And so I'd like to ask you to kind of speak about this concept of discovering care, what this means.
Well, I think what immediately popped in my mind was because of my daughter Annie living in New York, near New York City, I often watch Governor Cuomo's daily briefing about the virus, and he showed a wall of masks, homemade masks that had been sent to New York City in the briefing this morning. And he said, you know what this wall is? It's love. And I think that that's how I think about care, is that when you start, I think the conventional way of helping is not to see what people care about, just see what people, what you believe or assess people need. And so it just changes everything if you start looking for what people care about and what their gifts and talents are that they care to offer the world, right? Like mask builders from all over the United States and beyond have been sending masks to Governor Cuomo. And it's like, it made me, I just was crying when I looked at that wall. And he said, you know what New York is? He said, it's love. And I would say that's what care is about. When it's visible, people, and I think like meaningful conversations, learning conversations, whatever you want to call them, they're to make visible what people care about so each other can recognize them. Like I go, there's no way to look at that map of masks and not find it touching and not identify with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, Mike, what would you say? I think a best example of anywhere I know is Mike and Diamond and their roving listening to discover what people care about and their gifts and talents, and to turn upside down the conventional idea of what a low-income community is and find it as a treasure chest.
So in our work in the neighborhood around us, what we've done is, so what I think about care is that that it's completely present in every household and between people. And when Mike was talking about, you know, making these things visible, that's what's not seen in our place.
Yeah.
People in our place are seen as people who don't have anything to offer to one another. And yet every day, if not in every hour of every day, people are being really generous and grateful with each other.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. And it's reminds me of one of my other favorite lines, but from Appreciative Inquiry, around what's the smallest change that you can make to create the biggest impact.
Yeah.
And discovering care or sharing, you know, love is certainly one of those. So this next slide is one that it's a framework of learning conversations from Mike. But I just wanted to speak to it briefly in the way that Michelle and I have used it really effectively over the years. And I know there's quite a few of you on the call who have been to mine or Michelle's workshops who would recognize this as well. And when we're looking at this discovering care as a motivation to act rather than telling people what we need them to do. So we're actually inviting care as well. And what always struck me with this framework, and Michelle and I have used this as one-on-one conversations, as small group conversations. We've used these 3 different areas in a World Cafe. We've used the overarching questions in open space. Like, you can really break this down, break it apart. But the thing that's always really struck me is the first one with the concerns, and where it's really specific about what I don't want to happen. So rather than asking people, you know, what are all your concerns, and having a lists and lists and lists of everything that people aren't happy with, this is actually asking what you don't want to happen. Like, I don't want my child slipping through the cracks of education. I don't want my neighborhood to be known as a crime area. I don't want my family to not know their neighbors, you know, whatever it is. But it's like what I don't want to happen. And then it's like it reframes and says, okay, we hear what you don't want to happen. Now, what's your preferred future vision? What do you want to create? What would you like to see? And the last one with the skills and ability that I love, because quite often I think we will do that, the dreams, the visioning, all the big blue sky stuff. And then people will walk away from a town hall meeting or whatever it is where they've done all their visioning and they go, oh, I feel good. I hope that the local authority get all that done that I told them that they should do. Whereas what this invites is buy-in. It invites people to offer their care, their skills, their love, their abilities by asking. So now we've talked about what you want to create in your future vision. What do you have to offer that? What are your skills? And it could be anything as small as, I've got an 8-seater van that I can drive kids to the homework club, or, you know, it could be anything at all. But what do you have to give? So yeah, it's quite an intentional framework in my mind that Mike and I have not spoke about since we did this training in Australia all those years ago. So is there anything you'd like to add to that, Mike?
No, I think it's great. I think it's wonderful.
Other Mike M,
Yeah.
anything you'd add?
Yes, I would. Around our place, what we talk with people about all the time is not what people want to see happen, but what they're actually doing.
Yeah.
Because we can figure out, what they're already doing is what they're motivated to act on. And
Right.
if we can be a part of what people are doing, then we can be a part of cultivating that so that it multiplies. We find it really hard to build on people's, opinions about something.
Mm-hmm.
But we really, just over and over again, we see people doing remarkable things in an area that people call a food desert. We have a guy who's growing 100 pounds of peanuts.
Ooh.
He's not noticed for what he's doing. And let me tell you, Indianapolis is not known as the land of peanuts in the United States.
But one thing that I love that you do, Mike, and Diamond, Mike's co-conspirator, they follow the energy always, right? They're
Right.
What you were saying, they look for what is happening or wants to happen, right? I think they also have a good radar for what wants to happen, right? And I think that's a really important part of this listening. And I know that Dee, that's the way you think very much so about what's emerging, right? What's the voice of what wants to happen in the future? It's really important. What's a little sign that could be a little spark that could be kindled, right? It might grow into a prototype, and then really something wonderful.
Absolutely. I remember talking with a resident in the caravan parks I was working on years ago, and asked one of the women, what is it, something that you could offer? And she said, oh, nothing. I'm uneducated. I don't have anything, got no skills. There's nothing I've got. And so I used that line, which you'd both know. Well, what would other people who know you say you're good at?
Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, I love that question. And just in case anyone didn't hear that or hasn't heard it, what would other people who know you say you're good at? And this woman said, oh, well, actually, I make a really mean lamb roast, and it's my mum's secret recipe. I'll bring it next week so you can try it, but you're not getting the recipe. And then all these other people going, and I'll bring this and I'll bring that. And we started having shared lunches every week. Like, it was just fabulous.
That's great.
So it is, the small things. So let's just keep moving for a moment. Now, I'm going to go through about 3 slides and then come back to you two. So with this idea of this top-down, bottom-up, if we're starting with an answer, we're recruiting people to implement that answer. And then we're looking for the answer for the additional problem of lack of motivation. So like Mike was just talking about. Whereas if we start with that learning conversation, then we're discovering what people care about, how they see the situation and what they want to offer. Then we're mobilizing. So we're having those learning conversations. And all these slides will be available to anyone who wants them to. So with these, thinking of the 2 paths and 2 solutions, if we go in identifying, or we go in with an answer and identify a need, we're inviting services to come and be the fixers, and then people are consumers, and that's saying that the programs are the answer. Whereas if we go in with the learning question, a learning conversation, asking questions about people want or what they care about enough to act on, we're mobilizing assets and people are community members, saying people are the answer. And I remember when Mike first showed me this lesson, and he talked about a program that he would want if it was something medical. You would want a program. They're not saying programs are bad and programs are wrong. You would want maybe something therapeutic to kind of work through. But if we're looking at it from a learning conversation like Mike M was talking about, that we're looking at, people are the answer. they're out there, they're doing stuff. Let's follow those threads of energy. Then we're looking at this people versus programs. And in a workshop, we would ask people to hold these people versus programs and have a discussion around what that looks like, and ask one person to stand on the chair. And so, as Mike says here, it's not enough for agencies to say, let's be partners. It takes intentional effort to create that space where citizens can get on the chair too. So they're, you know, equally placed and can assume that responsibility and that power. So I'll go on to the next one in a second. So just thinking of those with the top down, bottom up, and the two paths, two solutions, what does that bring to mind for you, Mike's?
For me, Mike, that it makes me think about that the elephant in the room often is power, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's my wife Carol and I deciding how to use our budget, or you know, what to have for dinner, or you know, from the most profound to the simplest. But in every relationship, there is some dynamic around power, and often power is distributed in an inequitable way. And I would say a big blind spot of help, human service and beyond, is that it is organized in a colonial kind of hierarchical model of helping. And that's really around the world. I will remember many years ago, I was at the Jeder Institute in Nova Scotia, and they had people from 35 countries in many languages, really checkered around the world, who were in their 6-week course on ABCD. And I was there just for one day, but I did the thing that Dee just described, this image of the chair. Everybody recognized it. They were absolutely familiar with it, with the kind of usurping of citizen space by helping institutions. And I feel like in some ways the most unrecognized part of ABCD, John McKnight's early work, was the idea about the unintended consequences of help, that you know, it disconnects people, weakens people to be overhelped. And so much of the way we're organized is the assumption is that more help is better. Not much of a, and I think that's true to this second. And it's really been set aside. Like once I heard John said, nobody much reads the red book, right? The community and its counterfeits. They read the green book about what to do, not about what not to do. And a lot of this, but I would recommend to anybody who hasn't looked at it that's really important. And I remember one of the first times I was working with ABCD in maybe 1992 or 3, we were in Ohio, and United Way was doing this training that was a year long. And the local newspaper had studied how help had weakened a very low-income neighborhood near downtown Denver. Downtown Cincinnati, that's now been pretty gentrified, and called Over the Rhine. And the headline on the front page of the paper was "Over the Rhine Smothered by Help."
Yeah.
And I think that is often what happens. And people don't have to, remember Judith Snow used to always say, people should have to give permission to be helped.
Mm-hmm.
And the assumption, so very often people's space is violated, I think, in the name of helping, and particularly if they're labeled people.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
So what I immediately thought of when I was going through those slides was my friend Carmen. So Carmen lives in our neighborhood. I've known her for over 30 years. I've known her since she was 12 years old. And Carmen, we wanted to have a meal to celebrate Carmen because she seems to be such a good neighbor and friend. And so we did this meal, and we invited her friends to come and say words about her. And her friend and one of her sisters both talked about how generous she was. This is a woman who hardly makes any money. She's been evicted almost from every block, block in our neighborhood. And they talked about how even when she had nothing, she would give them the little bit that she had when they were in dire straits. Now, one of the people who said this was somebody that we as the church had given a lot of money to over the time. And I got mad about this. I'm like, hey, we've done stuff as this institution to be really helpful. But I didn't say that. I just thought about it. And then to bring it to this current moment. So one of the things some people talked with me about after I told them about being mad about this, that they said, well, Carmen's the one who knows. Carmen's the one who knows what people are going through. And so when we've been going through this crisis right now with people losing their jobs and everything, some people have given our institution money to be helpful and useful to people. But what we did was we turned around and gave it to Carmen and said, you know what to do with this. You do it. Yeah. So we had to step aside ourselves. So.
And I would dare say for a lot of that, or maybe when you first started doing that, there's a lot of trust involved there, and trust can take time to build as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
We had to, one of the things we decided was going to be a principle was we believe people.
Beautiful.
Wow. That's powerful.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we've got about 7 or 8 minutes. So thinking of this 90-10 principle, and that people versus programs, and this talks about, that we can have both. And when Michelle and I teach it, the way that we draw it up, like Mike talks about with the geometry lesson, but we talk about it like a tipping point, and that we can step by step, we can move towards that tipping point of where you might start off with agency being 90% of what's happening, and the 10% is just because people turned up to your group. But then in having those learning conversations with them and asking, what do you care about enough to act on around here? We're shifting them to 20% and an agency to 80%. And so we can continue that. And I was involved with a project that we shifted the complete service delivery model to community-led just by these small incremental steps. So I'll talk about that one in a second.
Great. Yeah.
So is there anything that you wanted to add around this, agencies? We can do both. Anything you want to add to that, Mike?
The only thing I would add is that working with power is difficult, obviously, and we all people for all sorts of reasons resist changing in who has the power. And I think institutions have a real challenge, and often people in an institution don't have enough clout to champion a real change, and that somehow you have to have the champions, and you also have to have a way to make visible a self-interest for the institution that it's worthwhile to change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That
for sure. Thank you. So it leads me on to this, which is a line, that leading by stepping back, that you and Henry certainly did a lot of work around. And so this is one that I want to share with you, Mike, which is where Michelle and I have taken it.
Oh, great.
somewhere else a little bit.
That's
It's
right.
still talking about that dance, that leading by stepping back. You might step in, you might step back, and you know what that looks like, and that it is a constant dance. There's a link down the bottom of a blog that I
Oh,
wrote if anyone's interested in that. But when we talk about the principal, this was from a story when I was working with a school, and we were looking at I was working with the residents of a caravan park and looking at bridging the gap for parents between the school and the park, because they were often called, and for those of you who don't know, caravan parks, they're like trailer parks. So they were known as, like, you know, the trailer park kids at the school, and there was a whole lot of stuff. So we were kind of building that bridge for parents to be more active in the school. And so that center figure in the circle there was the principal. And look, he was totally happy for us to be there. He was like, yep, absolutely. But he'd, you know, like, pat us on the head, go and do that community stuff over there in the library. That's really good of you. I'm busy, I'll be in my office. And but we needed him as well. You know, we needed everyone to be part of this in kind of mobilizing the school and all the people within it, all the stakeholders, parents, kids, the whole lot. And so what we did, and this is represented by the circles going round and round and round and round, is that we mobilized those latent assets. What was there already? What was kind of that low-hanging fruit? What could we tap into? And we created almost like a whirlpool of excitement and energy and things that were happening. And it started to expand and expand. So the principal stepped out. So this is where it taps into that 90-10 that it kind of alludes to in the corner there. Because when it started off, the principal was only in about 10% and we were doing most of it. But we needed the principal on board as well. So this was over about 2 years, this took. But he stepped out. He moved out of that circle and went, very good, you do that over there. Over a period of time, he started to hear what was happening. People started to congratulate him on things that the school were doing. Other community businesses were saying, we want to be involved too. He's like, in what? Like, so he had to have a bit more of an understanding. And then I heard him at a conference when it had clicked for him, talking about this wonderful school that he was part of and all this great stuff that was happening. And he had to circle back in to be in the center of it, because people were asking him more questions now because it was so successful. So, and it wasn't from lack of care, like, he really enjoyed it. So when we talk about the principal, it is about having the mandate to be in a place like that. Don't
right.
let no stop you. You know, like, keep mobilizing those latent assets. It will continue to build. Anything you'd like to add to that, either of you?
No.
Cool. All right. Got a couple of minutes. So these we can send to people. I won't go over them in depth, because we've got one final question that I'd like to ask Mike. But these are some of the principles from one of Mike's handouts that, like I said, we can share. And you'll see the last one there, that organizations as servants, that leading by stepping back.
One thing I would like to comment on is number 8,
Yeah.
ask, which came directly from Judith Snow, who's no longer living, but who's so much influenced both Mikes here. And it was an amazing community builder, an amazing human being that we both love. And she used to say that was the bottom line. It was invitation. People would often ask her, so how do you build community? And she used a mechanical wheelchair, and she would say with a nice smile, you ask. And then they'd say, well, what else do you do? She would say, keep asking. And by that time, there's a glare on her face. And then they say, but there must be something else. Never stop asking. And then she would turn away and go and roll away. But I think that's just very important. And Mike and Diamond are a community of invitation, of hospitality. And I think I read the other day somebody talked about how so much of modernism is really a structure of violence, right? The competition, the inequality, the racism, and somehow we have to move towards structures of love. And invitation is a profound structure of love. Like I was talking to Diamond this morning, Mike's dear friend and co-conspirator, I think, of the Roving Listener. And he was talking about interrupting the patterns of racism through invitation. And I think that's a profound point.
Thank you. So we'll move on to this last question, and we've got Terry on the call with us. I asked Terry, if you could ask Mike one question, what would it be? So I'm going to go with that. Thank you, Terry, because I really loved it. Loved the question. So he did put a bit of background, a bit of context in there about, you know, we do have, and we're the same here in Australia, and our other parts of the world we run trainings in, that we do have a lot of people who are from institutions or, as we would say here, from government or non-government services agencies, who are speaking as an outsider. So the question for Mike is, what key insights or advice based on your experience do you have to share with outsiders about working within a community to most effectively foster ABCD practice principles and values? So that's the last question I will invite you both to respond to.
Mike, why don't you respond first, and then I'll say something.
Well, you know, when outsiders come from outside our community, who they always want to come talk to is me and the leaders of other institutions in our neighborhood. And they don't want to come and talk with what we call the genuine articles, the people who actually live there and whose gifts are at the heart of what life and community is about in this place. So my thing about the key insight or advice is to never to start with people like me.
Maybe the one thing that I might say about it is, in a way, I think ABCD is a language, a method that is meant to move institutions. It came from, as many of us know on this call, it came from looking at in various parts of the world at community efforts where citizens, people were at the center and what were the kind of conditions present. But I think the audience, for good reasons, has been mainly helpful institutions. And I think the impact of ABCD has been to help at least a goodly number recognize that it's in their interest to, as Henry would say, to lead by stepping back, to do the kind of thing that Mike talked about, to not talk to Pastor Mike, but to talk to the genuine articles as the guide to how to invest in a community. And I think ABCD has been really successful at that. And I don't find it a limitation or a problem. You know, sometimes I think different foundations, for example, experiment with and have learned a variety of ways to help strengthen residents' initiatives. And people need resources and sometimes they need skills. But fundamentally what they need are institutions to step back, get out of the way, and let them do what they've done since the beginning of millennia.
Thank you. It reminds me of there was a job description that came out of an organisation in Sydney, probably about, I don't know, a decade or more ago now. And the job description for the community development worker was go out into the community and do nothing. And so they did. they went out and wandered around the streets and talked to people and did nothing, and a whole lot happened. And it also reminds me of the saying or the quote that Michelle and I use a lot of Mike's about the starting anywhere leads everywhere.
Yeah.
I just love that. Yeah. Well, thank you both. I'm going to take those slides off now. Stop share the screen.
May I say one other thing, Dee?
Yeah.
I was just thinking about Terry's, the question he's mainly not asking me or us, he's asking himself. And I think, like, what is worth doing to support stronger communities, right? And I think training in many ways is a suspect activity. And it's very popular with people who are professionals, right? Including myself. I with Henry, led something called the ABCD training group. So, but more and more, I recognize it really didn't make much difference. What I think we concluded after doing, well over 100 workshops, sometimes as much as a week, is we would identify 2 or 3 people who were leaders in a community or an organization who really wanted to do something different. And that we realized more and more that's why we did the workshops. It did make some change, and in unexpected ways people started doing stuff, but coaching to me is a much more valuable activity than training. And often people just need to be, like so often happens in Mike's community, they just need to be invested in what they're already doing and their brilliance allowed to shine. And I think training is way overutilized, including by ABCD Institute practitioners.
Thanks, Mike. So we've got about 15 minutes before we'll do a quick checkout. And I'm sure that between the 21 of you, there's probably a whole lot of questions. So let's just hear from a couple of people, and we can always put questions in the chat and we can get them back to Mike and Mike for some other response after, if possible, or if needed. So is there anyone who's got a reflection or a question that they'd like to share?
I suppose just one comment. You mentioned earlier on the appreciative inquiry comment about small things. I've always found that by accident, before I even knew anything about appreciative inquiry approaches, that the small things always make the biggest difference. And often it's the quirky small things that make the gigantic differences. And I've always loved working in that quirky space. But the real comment I want to make besides that was just to look at the similarity between appreciative inquiry and some of the asset-based work, that starting with a question always pushes us in a particular direction. And whatever question we ask is the direction we're going to go in, taken from appreciative inquiry. I think that's really important in the approach that you've got there, Mike, with the principles you've got there with the question. I think that's really, really important to remember, that the sort of question we ask is going to push us in a particular direction. Just my comment. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks, Alan.
I love how those are really one thing, and very much particularly in Australia, right? They've really been like 2 sisters united, right, in work, and I think it's really a great thing. And I think all the more appreciative ways of thinking of the world are particularly valuable now. In some ways, when you think about the world with the virus, we're really thrown upside down, right? The world economy is on the edge of collapse. The people are dying everywhere, sick everywhere. There is such a degree of uncertainty, of fear, trauma. But in the midst of it, there's also huge creativity, innovation, and possibility, right? We're thinking about, I think about something that Margaret Wheatley said in um, Who Do We Choose to Be, a book a few years ago, that we have to be both hospice workers and we have to be midwives at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Any other questions or reflections for either mics?
I've got a question, and I'm sitting here trying to put it into a question. But it's around, I'm going back to the smothering by help and the labeling people. And that really resonated with me. One, because my previous role to Tamarack was 12 years in public health. And that's what we did.
Oh,
we smothered and we labeled. And so
right.
how, as somebody who is working with community and trying to coach and guide through ABCD, how do we help coach those people to change their language and to change the traditional way that like public health has always been done? We're the experts, we know what you need to do. Eat fruits and vegetables, get exercise, and you'll be healthy.
Right. Well, for me, this, Mike, I have two thoughts. One, I would love to talk. You're in Canada.
Yeah.
Sometimes let's have a conversation about it for longer. But I think that I would love to talk to you more about that.
Okay.
But I remember once I was on a plane with John McKnight in the early 90s when we were traveling a lot together and working. And I said, so what do you consider unique about ABCD? And he laughed as he drank a martini, which he drank in those years. And then he said, there's actually nothing original except one idea. He said, in general, I just am good at Blarney and a good communicator is all we did. We took other people's ideas and experiences and made it intelligible where people could relate to it. But he said there was one idea, and he said that was the iatrogenesis of help. He said there'd been a lot of research about how medical therapeutic interventions have unintended side effects. Anytime you get a treatment, you get to hear all the ways that the treatment might kill you, right? But in other kinds of help, there's no warning label. The assumption always is more is better. And he said the principal side effect, unintended consequence of help is disconnection. It undermines community. And I've thought about it ever since. And I think there are practices people could pay attention to what they're doing. Are they lifting up leadership? Are they lifting up the voice of people? Like the stories that Mike told of the Broadway community neighborhood, they're all about that, right? They're going against that idea of helping people as recipients, but really supporting people as citizens and not people who act out of care. I mean, is one definition back to the time of the Greek and Latin language of citizen is people who care and act together. So I think there are practices, and there's also a need for more evaluation of the degree to which help does that. And I think it's somewhat of a blind spot for governmental funding, foundation funding, and helping agencies. I think it's a painful area to look at, but it's really important. And somebody like you, Heather, could make a real difference by really digging into that and communicating it. And you have a forum for people to, critically think about that question. And I think in some ways it got sidelined at ABCD over the years as too, in a certain way, is too difficult a question. Like it's not a question in the Green Book. It's ignored in the Green Book, I would say. it's more aspirational. But this is why I would recommend the more critically thinking, the red book, right? The Community and Its Counterfeits, What Not to Do, has a lot of stuff of value about this question. I'm sorry, somebody was speaking.
Go, Mike.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, when I was thinking about this related to public health, I thought about a visit we made several years ago to a physician named Dr. John Rich, who had been a physician working in the emergency room of a hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. And it was a hospital that served the low-income community. And he's African-American from Queens in New York. And he was seeing a lot of people who looked like him, who'd been shot and stabbed. And what he did was he hired them. And he hired them to be community health advocates for what he called the health crew. Because he said, who knows more about health than these guys, and who cares more about it? Yeah, nobody.
These are perfect.
The and then he said to us, nobody, he said to us, who are the healers in your community?
Yeah.
And nobody had ever asked us that question. Yeah. And no public health official, no church official, nobody. And then he said to us, when we started naming people who people go to when they're sick or addicted or troubled or an accident or whatever, he said, okay, what are you doing to support those people?
Yeah.
That's a really good question for a public health apparatus.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. And I've just put the link to Mike M's book in the chat because it's got some fabulous stories in it. And Mike sent me one when it was first published, I think. And I read it, and then I wrote in the cover that this is now a community book and it needs to move around. And I sent it to Michelle, and she read it and wrote her name in the cover, and she sent it off to someone else, and we'll see where it lands. But it's got some fabulous
great book. And it's you can buy it or get it online too, right, Mike?
Yeah.
It's an audiobook or a whatever the word is, Kindle type book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can I just jump in there quickly, Dee? Just talking about the book, Mike, one of the most powerful stories for me, and it was like just reinforcing, but that real aha moment was the story about the we call them a food bank here, just changing the questions that you were asking when people were coming for emergency food relief. And I've actually shared that with a lot of food banks around, just saying, actually, do you ask? And nobody, and everybody has that amazing aha moment. So thank you for that gift.
Do you want to just clarify that, Michelle? Do you ask what?
Oh, well, actually, I'll let Mike explain the story and where, just briefly, and where it came from, and how changing the questions we ask, can have powerful consequences.
So we had a food bank, in our church and a low-income community, and people would come and we would ask them the questions that we were supposed to, which is, how much income and how much expenses do you have? How needy are you?
Yeah.
How poor are you, basically? And somebody once in the church gave me a really hard time about that and said, if you believe everybody's gifted, how come you aren't asking people about that? And so we started asking people about what gifts they had. And when we did that, the first person who came to us was a little woman who lived about a half a block from our church named Adele Almaguer. And she told us she was a good cook. So we said, prove it. And she said, what do you mean? And we said, well, cook for the custodian and the secretary and the pastor at the church. So she did, and we paid her for it. Over the next 9 months, she did that for 4 different groups in our neighborhood. She cooked for them and they paid her for it, and they all loved it. So then the Chamber of Commerce in our area, the business group, called and said they wanted to hold a meeting at our building, and we told them they could do that. And they said, since we're going to be there all day, we need to use your kitchen. We said, well, you can use our kitchen, but we would prefer you use our caterer. And they said, okay. And we took $20 and bought her 1,000 business cards that said La Chaparrita Catering, spunky Tex-Mex food. And she said 70 of the business and civic leaders in the community, they passed out her business card to everybody there. Through that, she got connected to the local business association. And out of that, a year and a half later, she started Adelitas Fajitas, a restaurant at the corner of 8th and Harrison in Elkhart, Indiana. Now, if we had asked, go ahead.
Mike, I was just thinking again of what Heather was talking about, and I can't remember them, but I just remember how helpful they were. But there were those you have often used from John McKnight's very early writing, those 5 principles to not be in league with the devil.
Right.
So could you name those?
Yes. The first one is never do something for someone that they can do for themselves. The second one is find another's gifts, talents, capacities, passions, and dreams, and find a place for them in the life of the community. The third is don't give poor people services, give poor people income, because poor means people don't have money. The fourth is if people are hell-bent on providing services rather than income, see that they're given in a way that people have agency and choice. And the last one is practice hospitality.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank
Beautiful.
you.
Thank you. Now, just mindful of 2 things. One is it's time for checkout, but second, did we finish the end of the story where she opened the restaurant on the corner?
Yeah, I mean, but well, the only thing I would say to her is if we'd asked her, tell us how needy you are, we would have all ended up poorer for it, and we would have missed a lot of great food.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thanks. So I'd like to thank you, both Mikes. If you want the slides, I can send them to you. It's titled The Mikes. And it was just the easiest way. So let me know. And I'd like to, thank you both so much. That was
it was
a
fun.
wonderful conversation.